Imagine this. It's the final days of World War II. You're a Japanese soldier, and for months, maybe years, your life has been nothing but battle, jungle, and the constant hum of hunger and fear. You've been trained that capture is the ultimate dishonor, that your enemy is a monster who will show no mercy. Then, you surrender. Exhausted, caked in mud, you march through the barbed wire gates of an American POW camp, expecting the worst. Instead of a torture chamber, you're led into a long wooden building. Pipes snake across the ceiling, with strange metal nozzles pointing down. You've never seen anything like it. Back on the islands, a bath was a rare luxury. A quick dip in a river, if you were lucky. Most of you haven't truly been clean in months. Lice are your constant companions, and the stench of sweat and grime is a permanent part of your uniform. American guards bark orders you don't understand, using sharp gestures to tell you to strip. Panic flashes through the ranks. Is this a trick? Some new, cruel humiliation? You've heard stories. You clutch your few belongings, your mind racing, but you obey. Hesitantly, you undress, and a rough bar of soap is pressed into your hand. You stand there, vulnerable, waiting for the blow to fall. Then a hissing sound fills the room, and it's not gas, it's water, hot water. Streams of it pour from the nozzles above. For a second you flinch, bracing for pain. But there is no pain. There's only warmth. The water cascades over your shoulders, washing away layers of filth you thought were part of your skin. The shock is so profound it's almost spiritual. You watch as a river of brown swirls down the drain at your feet. For the first time in years, you are clean. This wasn't just about getting clean. It was a complete shattering of their worldview. These men were taught that suffering was a badge of honor, that filth and hardship were tests of their warrior spirit. And here, their enemy was forcing hygiene upon them. They were handed thick, soft cotton towels, a luxury they hadn't seen since before the war. They buried their faces in them, inhaling the clean, chemical scent, marveling at the softness. Of course, suspicion lingered. Was the soap poisoned? Was this a prelude to something worse? Every day they expected the other shoe to drop, but it never did. Instead, the showers became a routine. Guards would march them in, medics would check them for lice and skin infections, and they'd be given delousing powder and fresh underwear. The results were undeniable. Sores began to heal. The constant itching from lice disappeared. Coughs and fevers subsided. They were healthier in an enemy camp than they had been fighting for their own emperor. This simple act of showering became a profound cultural clash. In Japan, bathing is a deeply ritualistic, communal act. Think of the serene onsen, the hot springs. It's about purification and connection. The American showers were the opposite. Industrial, efficient, impersonal. Yet this sterile mechanical process was providing a level of care they had never experienced in the military. It was a system that prioritized human health, even for its captives. This realization was a slow, creeping dawn. It gnawed at their pride. Their entire belief system, built on endurance through suffering, was being challenged by a bar of soap and a hot shower. They began to see that hygiene wasn't a sign of weakness, but a form of strength, a weapon against the disease that had killed so many of their comrades in the jungle. It was a difficult lesson, one that forced them to reconsider everything they'd been taught about their enemy and about themselves. As the weeks turned into months, fear gave way to something else: anticipation. The daily shower was no longer a source of anxiety but a moment of strange liberation. Standing under the hot water, feeling clean, wrapping themselves in a soft towel, it became a small, sacred ritual. It was a moment where they could reclaim a piece of their own humanity, a sliver of dignity that the war had tried so desperately to strip away. In the end, these men learned that captivity could teach lessons far beyond survival. It taught them that humanity can be found in the most unexpected places, even in the hissing nozzles of an enemy shower. It showed them a different kind of discipline, one rooted not in enduring filth, but in overcoming it. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most significant battles aren't fought with guns, but with water, soap, and a new perspective. Imagine this. After months, even years, of brutal island combat, living in filth, enduring disease and starvation, a Japanese soldier is captured. For him, surrender is the ultimate dishonor. He expects cruelty, humiliation, or worse. Instead, he's marched to a shower hall. He's stripped, handed a bar of soap, and told to wash under a stream of hot water. For a man trained to see suffering and grime as badges of honor, this simple act of cleanliness is deeply confusing. Initially, every trip to the showers was filled with suspicion. The prisoners whispered among themselves in the dimly lit barracks at night. Why would the enemy waste precious resources like hot water and soap on them? Was it a trick? A psychological experiment to soften them? The Imperial Army had taught them that enduring lice, dirt, and sickness was a sign of a warrior's toughness. Complaining was weakness. But here, their American captors enforced hygiene not as a luxury, but as a core part of a system designed for health, order, and efficiency. The first changes were physical and impossible to ignore. Skin caked with months of sweat and grime began to clear. Infections healed. The overwhelming stench that had filled the barracks started to fade, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of soap. Men who had been wasting away from disease and poor conditions began to feel physically stronger, cleaner, and, oddly, lighter. But the real transformation was happening on the inside. This enforced cleanliness sparked a profound mental shift. The ritual of washing began to stir long-suppressed memories of home. Some remembered childhood baths, the steam rising from wooden tubs. Others recalled the communal warmth of Japan's public bathhouses, the onsen, a cornerstone of their culture. Here, in an enemy camp, these fragments of a peaceful life were unexpectedly returning. The soap and towels were no longer just objects. They became symbols of a civilization that could extend care even to its enemies. The details of this new life became fascinating. Prisoners would compare different types of soap, debating which one lathered best. They learned to fold their towels with meticulous care, a small act of personal agency in a world where all their freedom had been stripped away. What began as a forced, humiliating routine slowly transformed into a shared ritual, a quiet bond of camaraderie. They were still prisoners, but they were clean. This experience forced a difficult reevaluation of everything they knew. They began to observe the American medics, the organized delousing of clothes, the systematic way disease was prevented. A grudging respect began to grow. The enemy, they realized, wasn't the monster from their propaganda. They were organized, disciplined, and possessed resources that allowed for a level of care that was simply unimaginable in the Japanese military. Where the Imperial Army philosophy was to endure filth until you died, the Americans demonstrated that strength included maintaining health and order. This was a revolutionary idea. It challenged their entire concept of what it meant to be a soldier and what it meant to be strong. Night after night, the conversations in the barracks changed. Talk of battles and strategy was replaced by discussions about water temperature and the surprising comfort of a clean uniform. Men would awkwardly admit their initial shock and awe at such a simple, human luxury. As the weeks turned into months, the daily shower became something the prisoners not only accepted but anticipated. It was a small sanctuary. Standing under the hot water, they could close their eyes and for a few minutes wash away not just the physical grime, but also the mental weight of fear, loss, and the horrors of war. It was a moment to reconnect with a sense of humanity they thought they had lost forever. The most profound realization was this: their captors' system worked. The barracks were healthier, the men were stronger, and a sense of rhythm and order was established in the chaos of captivity. Pride slowly gave way to respect. They had been taught that surrender meant total degradation. But here, standing clean with a fresh towel, They discovered that human dignity could survive even in the darkest of places. They began to understand that their own view of honor and strength might have been incomplete. This wasn't about converting them to a new ideology. It was about something much deeper. It was the slow, dawning recognition that the enemy was also human, operating under a different and in some ways more effective philosophy. The simple daily act of washing became a quiet lesson in a different kind of power. The power of systems, of resources, and of a humanity that could be maintained even in the midst of a brutal war. It showed them that civilization wasn't just about fighting, it was also about caring, healing, and preserving life. This story reminds us that war is not just fought on the battlefield, but also in the minds of those who live through it. And sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but an unexpected act of humanity that challenges everything you believe. In the quiet passage of months within the barbed wire fences of the prison camp, something unexpected began to take root. What started as forced compliance, a daily ritual met with suspicion and fear, slowly transformed into a series of deep, lasting impressions that would forever alter the world view of the Japanese prisoners. They could no longer see their American captors as just enemies. They were now observers of a system, a philosophy, and a standard of living that felt worlds away from anything they had ever known. The daily trip to the showers, once a source of dread and mistrust, became a powerful symbol. It was a stark lesson that captivity didn't have to strip a man of his dignity, and that cleanliness wasn't a sign of weakness, but could coexist with strength. The hushed conversations in the barracks began to change. Gone were the cautionary whispers about the enemy. Instead, men began to reflect on what life could be like outside the confines of war. They spoke quietly of those first moments under the showers, of the profound shock of warm water cascading over their bodies, a sensation many hadn't felt in years. They talked about the unfamiliar, clean scent of soap, a smell that had no parallel on the battlefields they had left behind. Some admitted, almost with a sense of shame, that the simple act of washing felt like a luxury, an indulgence they hadn't earned. Others wrestled with a deep contradiction. Their entire lives they had been taught that suffering builds honor, that enduring hardship was the mark of a true warrior. Yet here they were in an enemy camp, gaining strength and health not through enduring filth, but through meticulous care. The psychological effects were undeniable. Soldiers who had been tormented by lice, their skin covered in scratches from constant insect bites and festering sores, now found themselves healthier than they had been in months, even years. The physical improvements were impossible to ignore. Skin began to clear, old wounds finally healed, and persistent coughs subsided. Their blankets and clothing, once stiff with grime, now smelled faintly of detergent. The barracks, which had once reeked of sickness and decay, began to feel more like a place of rest. Even the smallest details became symbols of regained control. A neatly folded towel, a pair of polished boots, orderly bedding, these were small fragments of agency in a life that was otherwise defined by total submission. This experience fundamentally reshaped their understanding of human interaction. They began to notice that the Americans enforced these hygiene routines not with cruelty or mockery, but with a surprising consistency and an almost impersonal sense of care. Hygiene, they started to realize, wasn't a privilege reserved for the victors. It was a fundamental requirement, a baseline standard of civilization. This realization sent ripples through their cultural foundations. In Japan, communal baths, or sento, and the cleansing rituals of hot springs were deeply embedded in tradition. But the brutality of war had stripped them of these practices. Now, paradoxically, it was in the hands of their enemies that a fragment of that cultural value was being restored. Some prisoners began to turn this lesson inward, reflecting on their own homeland. If an enemy could provide such consistent care for its captives, what did that say about the systems and structures they had left behind? Conversations turned to whispered comparisons, the scarcity of resources in their own army, the casual acceptance of disease, the expectation to endure preventable discomfort as a sign of toughness. The irony was not lost on them. America, the great enemy, had introduced them to a standard of life they had been denied by their own commanders. These new habits began to stick. Soldiers who had once considered frequent washing a frivolous waste of time now took great care to scrub themselves thoroughly. They began folding their towels neatly and maintaining their clothing and bedding without being ordered. Some even took it upon themselves to instruct newer arrivals, sharing the knowledge of this strange new routine as quietly as they once shared old war stories. In this way, hygiene became more than just a means of survival. It transformed into a form of silent resistance against the dehumanizing aspects of war, a way for each man to hold on to his individuality, his pride, and a small measure of control over his own body. The impact rippled out into the social fabric of the camp. Relationships between prisoners, once marked by suspicion and competition for scraps, began to soften. The shared, awkward experience in the showers became a new point of conversation, of camaraderie, and even humor. Soldiers would laugh about their initial fear of the hot water, exchange tips on the best way to scrub their uniforms, or compare the different types of soap. What began as a moment of profound humiliation slowly transformed into a communal ritual, a small but powerful thread that bound these men together. When the war finally ended and these men returned home, the memories of the camp persisted, but not always in the way you'd expect. The shower, the soap, the clean towels, for many, these simple objects had left an imprint far deeper than the trauma of battle. They carried these hygiene habits with them into civilian life, insisting on regular washing and teaching their children the importance of cleanliness and self-respect. They couldn't forget the lesson their enemy had taught them, that true strength didn't require needless suffering, and that dignity could be maintained even in the most dire of circumstances. This cultural reflection was often uncomfortable. It created a clash between their ingrained sense of national pride and the undeniable lessons they had learned in captivity. Some men bristled at the idea of acknowledging the superiority of any American practice, but others quietly recognized that their understanding of honor, strength, and civilization had been incomplete. The simple, undeniable fact that their captors had provided care, not just cruelty, forced them to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about humanity, discipline, and the ethics of war. Looking back, those showers were so much more than a daily routine. They were a lens through which the prisoners glimpsed an entirely different civilization, a different set of values. They represented a system where human life and dignity were considered important, even for those declared enemies. It remained a bitter paradox. The care had come from those they had been taught to hate, but it carried lessons about strength, resilience, and respect that they could never ignore. As the seasons turned and the day of their repatriation drew near, the memory of the showers had become something almost sacred in the minds of many prisoners. They symbolized the first cracks in the rigid, unyielding worldview that had been imposed on them by their officers and by wartime propaganda. They taught a profound lesson, that endurance of suffering was not the only path to honor, that health and cleanliness were their own forms of power, and that true civilization could extend compassion even in the midst of conflict. Years later, when some of these former prisoners shared their stories, they would recount the initial fear, the gradual acceptance, and the eventual quiet awe at what had once seemed so strange. Unlike the chaotic stories of combat, which often faded or blurred with time, the memory of hot water, soap, and clean towels remained incredibly vivid. It was a permanent marker of a different world they had glimpsed behind barbed wire, and it shaped their attitudes toward their families, their health, and their understanding of what a society should provide for its people. The lesson was not just about physical cleanliness. It was the recognition that a system could maintain order, care, and respect all at the same time. For these men, the showers had been a revelation, a quiet, subtle education in humanity, administered through the most mundane of acts. As the war drew to a close, a quiet transformation was taking place within the barbed wire fences of American POW camps. For the Japanese prisoners held there, the looming prospect of repatriation brought with it a wave of reflection. Months, and for some, years, of daily routines, strict schedules, and enforced hygiene had left an indelible mark. These were men who, shaped by a military culture that often glorified endurance of filth, had initially feared the showers. Now, they viewed them as a strange, paradoxical symbol of the care they had received from their captors. It wasn't indulgence, it was discipline, order, and a perplexing form of humanity. The journey home across the Pacific was filled with these quiet reflections. On the decks of ships bound for defeated Japan, former soldiers spoke in hushed tones about the lessons learned behind the wire. Conversations often circled back to the same unlikely topic: the showers, the soap, the clean towels. These daily rituals had been both a source of initial humiliation and, ultimately, a transformative experience. Later, when reunited with their families, some would try to explain this, awkwardly and in fragments. They would speak of their astonishment at the level of care provided by the enemy. Their relatives, whose minds were filled with images of wartime heroism and brutal sacrifice, struggled to comprehend it. How could an enemy, one they were taught to despise, show them such meticulous attention? The contrast upon their return to Japan was stark and immediate. The cities and towns they came home to bore the deep scars of bombing and extreme deprivation. Resources were critically scarce, and basic hygiene was a luxury few could afford. Yet the lessons carried from captivity endured. In the midst of this devastation, former prisoners clung to the habits that had been ingrained in them. They maintained regular bathing, careful washing of clothes, and a new, profound attention to cleanliness. These weren't just personal habits. They were practices they taught to their children, reframing hygiene not as mere vanity, but as a form of strength, discipline, and resilience in the face of chaos. It was a piece of order they could control in a disordered world. But the imprint of the camp experience went far beyond physical cleanliness. It reached deep into their psychology. These were men who had been raised on the belief that suffering was a warrior's honor. Now they began to understand that endurance alone was not the true measure of a person. Many quietly admitted, if only to themselves, that their time in the camps had fundamentally altered their understanding of human nature and civilization itself. The enemy, who propaganda had painted as a brute, had demonstrated that organization, resources, and a deep respect for life could be maintained even in the midst of a global conflict. Over time, the stories of the showers, whispered among friends and sometimes recounted in memoirs, became a powerful metaphor for these broader lessons. They came to symbolize the surprising potential for humanity to surface amidst conflict, the power of structured systems to preserve dignity, and the unexpected ways that culture and values could be transmitted, even across the battle lines. For some, of course, the memory of that steaming water and foaming soap remained a bitter reminder of defeat and surrender. But for many others, it was a source of reluctant admiration, a testament to what a society could achieve when it combined efficiency with a fundamental sense of care. It was a quiet, persistent puzzle they would ponder for the rest of their lives. Historians who later interviewed these former prisoners noticed something remarkable. In the vast tapestry of their wartime recollections, the experience of the showers stood out with consistent, vivid clarity. Tales of battles fought, of hunger, of fear, these often varied, faded, or became jumbled over time. But the memory of the daily act of bathing remained sharp and detailed. It wasn't the dramatic fight against the enemy that lingered most powerfully, but this quiet, repetitive, and almost mundane assertion of hygiene, health, and order. It represented a form of civility so foreign to their own wartime experience that it was simply impossible to ignore or forget. This routine became a fixed point in the chaotic timeline of their memory. This seemingly simple act also became a lens through which these former soldiers began to reevaluate their own military traditions. They started to question the cultural valorization of suffering and filth that had been so central to their training. The irony was not lost on them. While their own army had celebrated endurance in the face of disease and grime, their captors had wielded hygiene as a tool of control, yes, but also of health, order, and even a strange form of empowerment. The contrast was stark, instructive, and completely unforgettable. It planted a seed of doubt about the values they had once held as absolute truths, prompting a quiet reassessment of what it meant to be strong. In the long run, this unexpected education in the POW camp subtly reshaped attitudes toward life, discipline, and society. The former prisoners applied these lessons of hygiene and order to their personal and family lives. They developed a new appreciation for the value of resources, the importance of routine, and the quiet dignity inherent in caring for oneself and for others. The paradox remained at the heart of their experience. It was in captivity, under the watchful eyes of those they had been trained to despise, that they first learned that strength could be expressed through cleanliness, that order could be enforced with respect, and that the principles of civilization could extend beyond national boundaries, even to an enemy. Many veterans of these camps carried these lessons quietly, often unspoken, into their adult lives. They didn't boast about the showers or the soap. It wasn't a story of battlefield glory. But their daily habits became a silent testament to the practices ingrained during their captivity. They taught their children to value hygiene, not as an indulgence, but as a form of personal discipline and self-respect. They understood the subtle power of structured routines and consistent care. For some, the memory always remained bittersweet, forever tied to the pain of defeat and the dissonance between what they expected and what they found. Yet it also offered a profound lesson in humanity. Even in the darkest of times, there existed a possibility for dignity, health, and respect. The showers, once feared as instruments of cruelty or control, became quiet symbols of a higher order. Ultimately, the story of these showers is about so much more than soap and water. It's about the collision of cultures, the unexpected revelations that can only come from captivity, and the enduring proof that civility, discipline, and care can fundamentally transform the human experience. For the men who lived through it, it was a lifelong lesson in resilience, humility, and the quiet power of systems designed not merely to control, but to preserve humanity. Their worldview was reshaped. They came to understand, in a way no lecture could ever convey, that a strength could be expressed not only through enduring hardship, but also through maintaining health and dignity. In the most unexpected of settings, they had glimpsed a world that valued life, order, and care. And for decades after, the memory of those showers lingered, a quiet, persistent reminder that even in defeat, humanity could be found, lessons could be learned, and respect could emerge from the most unlikely of places. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more hidden histories. We'll see you next time.